Good afternoon, Remnant Church. Today's passage is from the book of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 42. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. This is the word of the Lord.
Good afternoon, Remnant. How you guys doing? Why don't you turn to your neighbor and share how you've been enjoying the good weather lately? Why don't we get to know each other a little bit? Weather's been nice. How have you been enjoying the weather? Hey, Mike. I think I heard some people saying it's too hot. Too humid. But I think, a lot of times when the weather gets better, a lot of people in New York City are so good about this. They maximize the weather. You see everyone out and about. You see so many people walking around the cities. In California, I feel like we just totally don't appreciate the weather that we have. Even if the weather's so good outside, we'll just stay indoors anyway because it's so cooler in the home. But I think for most of us, even if it was too hot or humid, I'm assuming many of us still went out to explore and live life and try different things. But the city was bustling with so many people. And I think it's so crazy that every time there's good weather, a lot of people maximize it. My wife and I find ourselves doing this. Every time the weather's just a little good, which is above 55, I would say, we go to the park no matter what with our daughter. We have to. Like, we have to capitalize on this weather. And I think, for us, as I'm talking about the sermon, Jesus' Life Reimagined, I wonder how much of us really maximize our time with the presence of Jesus. And maybe maximize is too a New Yorker of a term, like, am I doing it well or efficiently? So how much are we enjoying and delighting in the presence of Jesus, the daily presence of Jesus, that he's in our lives? Like, how much of our day-to-day is actually set before him to delight in him, right? Because I think when opportunity arises, maybe it's not just a good weather, maybe it's a vacation, maybe it's a job, maybe when circumstances are in the right setting, we maximize that opportunity. But how many of us, when it comes to who Jesus is and recognizing his presence, do we really delight in that? Maximize it in the day-to-day grind that we live in. And so today's sermon, as we're titling, is Jesus' Life Reimagined. Life reimagined in Jesus. And what we're going to look at is actually the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to chapter 5 in its entirety. And Luke 8 actually does the same thing. And what you realize is there's 4 characters that Mark presents to us, and how they relate to Jesus and how they meet Jesus. And these 4 characters are the disciples, right? 12 eclectic men that Jesus brought together, and they are following Jesus, and they're in a storm. There is a Gerasene demoniac, the man who's possessed by a demon, and he falls at the feet of Jesus. There's Talitha, this 12-year-old girl who is on the brink of death, and who her father Jairus comes to Jesus saying, please heal my daughter, the story that we just read. And in between the story of Jairus and his daughter Talitha is a bleeding woman who's bleeding and suffering for 12 years. And the strange thing is all these people are so varied in their life experience. They're so different in what they're going through. And what Mark is trying to present to us in the gospel is this, that Jesus has the full authority and power to meet every single person exactly where they are. Despite their experiences, life background, the circumstances now. And that's where Jesus has the full authority to reimagine life. The only thing that connects these 4, other than being in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke sequentially, right, is that they all encounter Jesus and their life is vastly different thereafter. So if you encounter Jesus, then the life ought to be different once we encounter his presence and walk with him. So in our life, as you're thinking about who Jesus is, and I bring up this sermon to just really reconsider and think about, how do I delight in Jesus? What does it mean, my life reimagined in Jesus? And here's the thing that I will present to us to really think about as we're going through the sermon, as we're going through the Word of God, especially in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4 to 5. Jesus' story is incredible, but he never makes himself unbelievable, right? There's nothing about Jesus, right, that is not incredible. All that God does to him as a Son of God, it's amazing. And some people, because there's aspects of Jesus that are too profound, too mysterious, too glorious, they tend to have fractioned understandings of Jesus. Like, I can only cope with Jesus who died on the cross and resurrected. But if Jesus who does miracles, in fact, the Gospel of Mark, being one of the shortest gospel, has the most accounts of miracles that Jesus does. And when you see the miracles of Jesus, it breaks our imagination reality of what Jesus can and will do in our lives. It simply exceeds what we think is plausible. And in some ways, it's incredible, but you're going to see in each encounter, and this is the thing I want you to understand, that he doesn't make himself unbelievable. He's approachable. He approaches the people. He meets with them where they are. And that encounter, once again, changes everything. And today, actually, in Greek Orthodox, they celebrate Resurrection Sunday today, Easter today. And it's so funny, I was thinking about this, and I always think about this during Resurrection Sunday. On Resurrection Sunday, we always scream like, he is risen, right? He is risen indeed. But that hasn't changed, right? For the rest of your life, the rest of the year, your eternal life, he is risen. You got me. Family, church family, he is risen. He is risen indeed. That hasn't changed. And his impact in our life hasn't changed. It's not just like, yes. And that's when, like Easter, everybody comes back to church and everyone's like believing in this. But this hope, this incredible story, it has not changed. And just because it's incredible, once again, it doesn't make it unbelievable. But rather, it's the disposition of the heart. Can you fathom Jesus, the Son of God, who does these profound miracles? Can you fathom a God beyond your imagination? Can you fathom Jesus in the way he walks with people, being fully God and fully human, and how he walked in the Gospel of Mark? And that's what we know, right? That he really came on earth, lived this life, and demonstrated the power and love of Jesus, the love of God itself, to the point that he conquered death and sin. We know this, right? We heard this message, especially on Resurrection Sunday. But as we live it out, as we believe in this and see this, as we go into the gospel more, there's two things I need us to kind of come to terms with, okay? I need us to be on the same page for us to really understand this. Otherwise, we're going to confine Jesus to the limits of our reality and imagination. One is this. I think we can all agree. Life is not two-dimensional. Life is not just black and white. There are circumstances we can't control. There's things that we go through that are unbearable. There's pain and hurt that we cannot even conceive. And the timing of that often is very, very inconvenient. It can hurt us. In fact, I would say many of us, even at the best moments, one bad day can take a turn for the worst. And life in that sense is not two-dimensional. Life has its ups and downs, it has its curves, and how do we get through that? You know, there's a story by Charles Dickens, Great Expectations, right? And there's a character in that story, Miss Havisham. And this character, Miss Havisham, what happens is this. On the day of her wedding, right before going to the altar, she receives a letter. And receiving the letter, it says that her fiancé has defrauded her, because she was a wealthy woman, has taken her money, and has left her at the altar. And this character, Miss Havisham, in Great Expectations, what she does is this. She pauses all the clocks in her house, in her mansion, at the time of the wedding when it should have been. And then continually throughout the story, she remains in her wedding gown that she wore that day, to the point that it gets discolored, it's tattered, and she becomes like this antagonist in the story. She hurts Pip, she hurts those around us because she was so hurt. So for Miss Havisham, she's stuck in this moment, this painful moment that has kept her stuck in life because she couldn't control the circumstances. So what she does instead in that story is she pauses time. She sets the clock to the hour. She remains in her wedding gown, unchanged. And some of us, because of the things that we experience in our life, we're stuck like that. Could we be stuck like that? And if something were to occur, is it possible for us to be stuck in that moment rather than be able to see that Jesus is at work? The second reality that I think we have to come to terms to is this, and I think this also we can all agree. Jesus is not two-dimensional. As we grow up in the church, a lot of people have this tendency to trap Jesus into what they learned and heard of him back when they were in 5th grade. Or in the best case scenario, you trap Jesus of what you know and learned of him in your college days when you were on fire. But your intimacy with Jesus has not grown. It has been limited. And in a similar circumstance like Miss Havisham, we've locked Jesus in place because certain prayers or expectations were unmet. Because certain circumstances did not happen according to our plans. Because something might have happened to us that has made us stuck. And that's exactly why Jesus' story is incredible. I don't know, do you guys relate to any of this in your journey with life, in your walk with Jesus? Do you have these moments in life where you really need to reconsider how you're approaching life, how you're approaching Jesus because you feel stuck? So as we go through these 4 stories, I want you to really think about it. Think about it in the state of like Mark as he's writing this. Mark, who's got the accounts of Peter, who works with Paul, he's writing this in one chapter, right, back to back. It's almost like if you were to just read the Bible right now, I actually wish we could just do that. Just read the whole thing in its entirety. You should be awestruck. It's like boom, 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 4 stories, back to back. Mark's after something, and Mark is trying to say, look at Jesus. He's so different. This is unlike any other man. And that's why he puts these stories back to back to recognize again and again how powerful is the Son of God. So the first group is the disciples, and this story that we're familiar with, we didn't read because it'd be too long to read. And in the disciples, you know that these 12 men are familiar with Jesus. They walk with Jesus. They've been called by Jesus. Not only do they hear his teachings firsthand, they see the miracles firsthand. They're commissioned firsthand. These are people who are near and dear to him. And yet what happens in the story is this. The circumstances don't align. They get stuck in a situation. And here's how the story unfolds. Mark writing this. Get excited. Mark chapter 4:35. On that day when evening had come, Jesus said to them, let us go across to the other side. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, Jesus, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care we are perishing? And Jesus awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And Jesus said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" These are men familiar with Jesus. These are 12 men who have known him, have heard from him, they believe in him, they've seen him do miracles. And yet in this situation, especially in the Gospel of Mark, this is the first time he calms the sea. Later on, you're going to see him calm the sea again, and then later on, you're going to see him walk on water. But this is the first nature miracle presented in the Gospel of Mark. Imagine this, guys. Jesus, the Son of God, in history, looking at the winds, looking at the sea, calming it with one word: peace, be still. Incredible. Crazy if you really think about it. What is Mark trying to point at? Well, Mark is trying to point at something that's significant in the authority and power of Jesus, that Jesus himself is not confined to a certain location. He's not confined to a geographical place. He's not confined to a moment when Jesus is teaching, that's when he's most powerful. When Jesus is doing a miracle, that's when he's most powerful. When Jesus is in the setting, that's when he's most powerful. Jesus moves when the setting is appropriate. And Mark is trying to hit that hard. Jesus was sleeping. The storm was raging. Is that an appropriate time for miracles? Would that be inconvenient? You need a Savior, but Jesus is sleeping. Can Jesus still be powerful? And Mark is trying to hit it and say this first nature miracle, recognize the Son of God. He who has authority over the winds and the seas has authority to reimagine life. Because the disciples couldn't fathom that. They knew they wanted to be saved, but they couldn't imagine that Jesus was going to calm the seas. In fact, that's why they end with this phrase, right? You can always leave the verse up, by the way. It might be helpful. This is why they have that verse. Thank you so much. Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? It's funny because the Gospel of Mark, when it starts, it says, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's how the Gospel of Mark starts. This book that I'm writing, the Gospel of Mark, about Jesus, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the point I'm trying to get at is this: Jesus is the Son of God. This is the Son of God at work here. And this is the dilemma that he's trying to play and see this tension in our lives. Look at these disciples who are so familiar with him. I started this gospel book letting you know Jesus who I'm going to write about, Jesus who I'm telling you about is the Son of God, and yet the people most familiar to him could not recognize this. To the point they say, who then is this? Can he really do that? Someone once said this, I forget who, but they said familiarity hinders intimacy. Familiarity hinders intimacy. We go through the habitual motions and we size up what we believe. Think about it in your relationship, especially those of you who might be dating or those in your married life. When you become familiar with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or familiar with your spouse, you just kind of made up your mind about them. You go sinking into routines, and that's when some couples are like, this is not fun. How do I express this? But you want intimacy. You want depth. You want to go beyond just what's familiar. You want to go beyond just being partners. You want to go beyond and just, someone present in my life. And familiarity hinders intimacy, and that happens in our relationship with Jesus too, especially on Sunday services. We know what's going to happen in a Sunday service. And if it goes a little longer, especially because our service hour is a little strange, our stomachs start growling. We expect the sermon to end at least by 12:55, and if it doesn't, you're like, what, 12:55? At least aim for 12:45, tell you, John. And if it doesn't, and it starts going a minute over, you're like, oh my gosh. And then the worship team goes up, you're like, they better sing like one song, not two. You're like, oh shoot, that hit me hard. But that familiarity hinders intimacy. Why can't Jesus interrupt our lives? Why is it so hard to slow down with God? Remember I asked us, maximizing the weather. Why is it so hard to maximize our time with Jesus, the creator of the universe? You know it says that in the Psalms, right? When they talk about God, God can still the winds. God can rebuke the winds. So when he's doing this miracle and the disciples know some of these texts, they should be thinking, okay, this guy is God. He can do it. Yet why is it so hard for our hearts to be still? And I would ask us, is it because we're so familiar? with what we expect him to do, of how he ought to operate, rather than him reworking the framework of our very imagination of God. This is what I'm trying to get at. We need to go beyond our understanding and beyond even our imagination of who God is, especially if you've grown up in the church, especially if you've been here a while. You need to go beyond this and go beyond familiarity and recognize this is the Son of God whom we worship. He is the creator of the universe. Even in the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning, he was with God. Jesus is not like any other person, religion, deity. There's no one like him. And he who commands the seas and the winds has full command and authority and power and deep affection to reimagine our lives. Jesus isn't confined to a location. He's not confined to a moment that's convenient. In the inconvenience, he speaks. And the disciples have to recognize this. So Mark leaves that dilemma. The people most familiar with him cannot seem to understand him. And then comes a story about the Gerasene demoniac, character number 2. And this is a man who is ostracized by society. He's been chained by people, and it says that he has evil spirits dwelling within him. Are some of you freaking out now? We're talking about evil spirits? Yeah, there's evil spirits, demons, principalities at play. But even in this story, what you realize is that Jesus is greater than any evil force, any evil power. And let me just reframe that too, so that's what we understand when we're reading this story. C.S. Lewis said this in some way, that it is unhealthy to have a deep obsession over demons, but equally be unhealthy to ignore them completely. There are evil things at play trying to tempt us away from Jesus. There are tendencies of the flesh that try to pull us from Jesus. And in this story about the Gerasene demoniac is this: Jesus, once again, as you go in the story, he comes to the other side of the sea. I imagine all these stories taking place in a span about a day or two. He's just crossing the sea and something else occurs. And so after Jesus going across the sea, calms the sea, he shows his power and authority, and the disciples who are most familiar with him don't understand him. He encounters this Gerasene demoniac, and here's what the story says. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of Gerasene, and when Jesus stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with chains. And they say this man was in the mountains screaming. He was cutting himself with stones. He had a terrible spirit within him, possessed by a demon. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out loud with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" You guys see that funny moment there? A demon understands that Jesus is the Son of God, when the disciples did not understand who is the Son of God. This is the thing that Mark's trying to play out. The worst kind of evil, the most evil force, the demon itself recognizes the Son of God and knows that he has to submit to the Son of God. He knows and bows down and says, "I adjure you by God, do not torment me." Why? Because Jesus is a far greater power and authority. No demon, no force has any jurisdiction over anything that God has done. This is the light that overcomes darkness. This is the thing that sets people free. This is he who gives us hope. And that's why he says, saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And then it says later on that he cast out the demons into a herd of pigs, right? And then man is set free. And then it says the man was back in a right mind, and the people saw this. And then as Jesus was getting to the boat, the man who had been possessed with the demon begged him that he might be with him, right? He's like, "Jesus, take me with you. Let me go with you." And then Jesus did not permit him, but he said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." There's a cool, interesting fact about this guy. His home is Decapolis. That's a place where there's a lot of Greek people. That's a place where there's not a lot of Jewish people, Gentiles. And here's one of the first instances in the Gospel of Mark. You see Jesus reaching beyond the people of Jerusalem. He's healing beyond just Jewish people. He's healing beyond and reaching borders and barriers. And he's saying, "You then go back home and proclaim about me." This is a God who's greater than any location, right? Once again, any circumstance and any culture. And this is a God who's greater than any force of evil and dark force, even a demon-possessed spirit. And after he casts this demon out, after he shows once again, the Gospel of Mark writing about Jesus, that he is greater than any demonic force, and this demon itself being legion, not having to name every single one, he casts it out, and his power is far greater. Do you know what the herdsmen say, the people who see this? The crowd that see this? They ask Jesus to go away. They ask Jesus to go away. Imagine that. They see this powerful miracle. They see this man who's been on the mountains, demonic. Even our framework of imagination, we can't understand that, right? Even me, some of you guys might be sitting here like, we're talking about demons right now? Cast him out. And the people are afraid. And they say, you need to leave us, Jesus. What if God were to work in a way that's beyond your imagination? What if God were to heal in such a way that's beyond what you can recognize? What if God were to minister to you beyond our realm or rationality? What if God works beyond your rationality and logic? Would that make you afraid? The herdsmen were terrified. They couldn't cope with this understanding. They said, you need to go. And the only person that seems to still want to be with Jesus is the man who was possessed and has been set free. He's like, I want to be with you. And Jesus sends him out. Jesus once again steps out of the confines of our imagination, and he interrupts this whole way that life ought to appear. That's demonic man. And the herdsmen who see this, the crowd that sees this, cannot compute. I'm going to have another honest moment with you on a Sunday service. You know, most of us, when they hear Sunday sermon, as soon as you walk out, they say like you remember like 9%, 10% of it at best. Right? Even for me, I'll like remember like 60% at best. This is like what they say. Right? And then throughout the week, like you might forget most of it, but what happens is usually if it's a good sermon, you just had one story or one verse that really hit you. But it's hard to take in the totality of what's going on in the totality of worship. I bring up this moment because even as we're sitting here, it's like if it can't cope in my rationalization, if it doesn't minister to me now, if it doesn't talk to me now, then I reject it until I find something that I can take and apply. Until I can find something that computes with me. And we can't fathom God working beyond our rationalizations, God working beyond the confines of our imagination. When God is doing something far bigger in his ministry, when Jesus is doing something far bigger, once again, to expand our imagination. And here's that hope. Jesus is greater than the forces of nature. Jesus is greater than the forces of evil. There's nothing that binds us. And Mark is showing this again and again so that we will not remain stuck. Then the next story comes up with Jairus and his daughter Talitha, right? And as this is back to back, think about this. Now you see Jesus calm the sea. The disciples could not fathom. You see a demon approach him named Legion with thousands of demons within him. Jesus casts it out, and then Jesus goes to the other side of the sea again. This is happening back to back. And now as he gets to the other side of the sea, it says this, and when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live. And he went with him. Have you ever been to a point of desperation? A point of desperation where you need God, you plead, you seek him. In Jairus' story, it's another yet different person, right? The demoniac man of Gerasene, he is a Greek person from Decapolis. The disciples are from an eclectic group of random people from random occupations. And now you see a synagogue leader, a ruler of the synagogue, come approach Jesus. And he humbles himself, and he bows at Jesus' feet. Beyond all his understanding, beyond all his understanding of intellect of how Jesus should operate, he actually is able to posture himself in humility and say, I need you to come. My daughter's at the point of death. A point of immense desperation. There's two ways people can operate. There's multiple ways, but two ways in this setting of pride. In this setting, what Jairus could have done, being a ruler in himself, is that he could have just forced his way through. Let pride continue to lead me. Let my efforts and work continue to lead me. Try everything to fix my daughter until he himself breaks. I'm just going to push through until Most of you guys know, if you've ever done this before, if you just push through alone, you break. Or you can choose to be broken and in humility ask for help. You can push through until you break, or you can choose to be humble and be broken and say in this desperation, I need you, Jesus. And Jairus does that. Beyond his rationalities, knowing who Jesus is, in his desperation, he comes to Jesus and says, I need you to come and heal my daughter who is 12 years old. Crazy. Mark sets up another conundrum. Jesus can conquer nature. Jesus can conquer evil forces. Can Jesus conquer death? Some of you are sitting here like, we learned that already, Resurrection Sunday. But does it really hit you? Does it really hit you that he's conquered these things? And what that means and the implications of what you're going through now in your unknown circumstances, in your unknown forces of evil might be happening, in your unknown non-two-dimensional life where everything's happening, and maybe not at the right time. Do you see that? And see Jesus is coming in. And can he conquer death? I wish we can go back to a time when we're reading this for the first time. We'd all be bewildered. Like, what? Jesus, are you going to be able to heal this daughter? And as the story should continue, this is the first time Mark interrupts the story. And he inserts the story of the bleeding woman when on his way to this 12-year-old daughter. On his way, right? He said, and he went with him. And on his way there, the following verse is this. There was a woman who had been discharging blood for 12 years, the bleeding woman. And she suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better but grew worse. Talk about another person in a desperate situation. I've tried everything to fix it. I've done everything. I've given my finances, my time. I've done everything. And yet, not only does it not get better, it gets worse. She had heard reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. A woman who had lost everything, who has given everything to heal herself. And in fact, in this society in the ancient Near East, if you are having this illness, people are so afraid that you might be contagious that you also are rejected and ostracized from society. She probably had no one near her. Not only is she physically feeling rejected, physically lost, she is rejected socially. She must be lost on so many levels, maybe emotionally and mentally. And she's lost everything to try to figure out how to heal herself. And there's something within her body that is causing death when there should be life. There's something that is causing in her body to decay and to feel pain and to be lost and broken when there ought to be life. And in that moment of desperation, just like Jairus, she comes to him and touches him. And Jesus, instantly as she touches him, she was healed. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power had gone out, immediately turned around the crowd and said, who touched my garment? Once again, Jesus is not confined to a location, a circumstance, or a place, a time that's convenient. Doesn't matter if he's sleeping on the boat. Doesn't matter if he's just crossing the sea. Doesn't matter if he's just walking because he's going to heal Jairus' daughter. Someone touches him. Jesus is Jesus, and he's the same in every place, everywhere. And his life explodes. And his life comes in and heals her. And he says, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. This is one of the few instances when after Jesus heals someone, he calls them daughter. Maybe like one of three. He doesn't want people to just have a mechanical relationship with him, where we come because we know he's powerful, we know he's good, so once in a while in a good Sunday moment, I'll come and I'll encounter him. And I'll walk away because I've been healed of a circumstance or a prayer has been answered, and that's more than enough for me to keep my faith going just a little more until the next thing I need to pray for. No, Jesus, when he enters in each of these people's lives, he doesn't just heal them. He doesn't just cast out the demon. He doesn't just stop nature. He makes them rethink their very life values, priorities. He makes them healed, of this woman, right? This woman healed not of her physical condition alone, but now she can be part of society. Now she belongs. Now she is made whole, not just physically, but emotionally, socially. She is healed. And in that belonging nature, he says to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. You belong. I don't want you to just receive miracles and healing and leave. I don't want you to just receive the power of God, just encounter God and leave. I want you to know me, intimacy, beyond familiarity. I want you to commune with me. I don't want you to just perform some sort of religious duty to be healed and walk away. I need you to commune with me and hear me. I need you to let me minister to you. And Jesus says that and receives that ministry. It's beyond a mechanical relationship. It's beyond just knowing the power of God, beyond just ritualistic practices, but to go deeper. And in that moment, as he's going to Jairus, his daughter, this interruption happens. And what happens in the verse right after, as he's saying daughter, as he's healing, as he's ministering to this woman, it says this, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. That's the tension Mark's building to. Can he conquer death? And now on his way, the timing is not right. It's inconvenient. All these things, right? It doesn't make sense. And finally, in this culmination, it comes to this point in the story of immense conflict. The daughter is dead. Nothing more can be done. And Jesus, overhearing this, it's not even said to him. And immediately he steps in and says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Only believe. Does this mean that, hey, if I believe more, if I have faith, as long as I believe more, I'll get my prayers answered, I'll be a good person? No, that's not what he's saying. Because even to the disciples, he's saying, you have lack of faith. He's saying this, come, trust me, don't be afraid. I can do it. I will do it. And then as he goes back with Jairus, he says he entered, and he said to them, why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And then what do the people do? Almost like the crowd that reject Jesus because they're beyond his rationalization, beyond their understanding. They can't cope with a God who can do more than they can imagine. They laughed at him. They laughed at Jesus. The person you need most, the person that can probably bring life into death, the person whom we need to experience far above anyone else, they laugh at him and mock him. But he put them all aside, took the child's father and mother who were with him, and went in there where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the little girl got up and began walking. He has authority over death. What are those implications in our life? How do we walk with this hope, knowing this? If Jesus is like the spoke of a wheel, like the core of the wheel, every facet of our life is attached to him. But many times as believers and people who are trying to be going to God, we think, okay, Jesus, I just need to work in this area of my life, my work. Jesus, I need to work here right now because I'm in lamenting and grief. Jesus, I need to work here right now in my finances because that's lacking. When Jesus is working in the totality of all of it. This is who Jesus is. This is the authority that he has. This is his authority over nature, over evil, over death, and healing. And he ministers to every single person, even in their faith, which may seem crippling. And Jesus ministers. This is who Jesus is. So looking at this, if there's something within us, I want to encourage you in this way, honestly. If you read this story, if you're thinking, it is what it is, could you ask God to soften your heart? Could you ask God to be in amazement of this again, to work beyond our imagination? Could you ask God to say, man, I cannot believe you're working in every single person's life in this way? Think about it. Every single person here, right? I know it's kind of weird because everyone's like looking always this way when one person's talking. But as part of worship, we're just reading the word, let Jesus minister to you. But even as you're looking around saying hi to one another, imagine Jesus is working in every single person's life and circumstance in this room. not just uniquely you. How amazing is that? Does that blow your mind? That he is actually knowing every unique story and ministering to each of your lives with intentionality and power and authority. And to see that happen. So there's two applications that I come up with at reading this. One was said by this guy at our Alpha seminar teaching that we went to, which is starting tomorrow. So if you want to invite someone, I encourage you, right? How can we not invite someone to know who Jesus is if he works in this way? But he said this, a fatal flaw of invitation is saying no to God on behalf of someone else. If Jesus works in this way, how can we say no to Jesus on behalf of someone else? How can we surmise that our coworker or our boss or our friend, they're not at the place to accept Jesus yet? How do we know what Jesus is doing in their life? We're not inviting them to ourselves or religion, but we're inviting them to the Jesus that the Gospel of Mark is presenting. He works in every aspect of life at an inconvenient time in any circumstance. And it would be a fatal flaw for us to reject Jesus on behalf of someone else and say, I cannot talk to them about Jesus because they're just not at the place in which they need it. We would never know what's going on in their life. So externally, think about this as we look at the Gospel of Mark in this way. He is incredible, but he does not make himself unbelievable. He makes himself known. So maybe there's people in your life that we can just share about Jesus, invite them to Jesus, not ourselves. And is there a fatal flaw in our own heart tendency to reject God or Jesus on behalf of someone else? The other one that's more core, personal to all of us is this. The fatal flaw of discipleship is to choose fraction lifestyles that attempt to compartmentalize Jesus rather than submitting the whole of our lives to the lordship of Jesus. You're like, so many stories, heard these stories, what's the point? Maybe it's really hot in here because some of you look like you're falling asleep. Bless you, rest in the Lord. The whole of your life, even in your sleep. But this is what it is. If any juncture of them decided to not submit to the lordship of Jesus, they would not have experienced this miracle. If there's a part of them that tried to rationalize it or say, Jesus, you don't fit into this, then it doesn't match their lifestyle, then they could have just rejected it. But the lordship of Jesus, the authority that he has, the life that we need to submit to, is the whole of our life submitting to him. Tell me, are we Christians merely because of a lifestyle? Are we Christians merely because we want a miracle? Are we Christians merely because we want to experience the power of God once and then walk away and feel good for a few months and then come back when we need it again? Or are we people who are really transformed by the whole of our lives because we submit to the lordship of Jesus, which you notice in his grace and mercy meets people where they are, has died on the cross for our sins, has just totally defeated sin and death. And that's where you and I have to honest moment and be responsible and actually respond in our own action. Is there a place of our life that has been fractionalized, that doesn't submit to Jesus? Have we compartmentalized Jesus in ways that he works only like this, mechanically like this, a formula like this? Or can we submit to Jesus the whole of our lives and say, you are Lord, and come in every aspect of my life? Is there things that have hindered us or sins of pride and ego that have pushed Jesus away? Then lay those down and submit to the lordship of Jesus. Especially as believers, especially as a church family, we don't want to be stuck. That's not how the life God intended it for us to have. But rather, in this life that is three-dimensional with everything going on, God is far greater, and he calls us out. So step into the lordship of Jesus rather than just pursuing a lifestyle, rather than pursuing just ideological beliefs that fit my pattern of life. If you want to experience Jesus in the whole of your life and see him do amazing things, the whole of your life needs to submit to the lordship of Jesus. That's everything. Let him work. Let him move. Submit to him. If this is the God who's risen, if this is the Lord, you can trust him. And so the question I just end us with as the worship team comes up is this. What would your story look like with Jesus then? To submit to the lordship of Jesus, to go beyond just our realm of imaginations and rationalities. Could you fathom God doing even a greater work in your life? Would you stand with me? I want you to just take a minute here before we go into worship and let Jesus minister to you, right? Just invite Jesus into this place. Awaken your hearts. And the question that I challenge you with, even as you enter into worship, oh no, I went 2 minutes over. You guys are wondering now about the song time. Past 12:55. Is can you submit to the lordship of Jesus? Is there any aspect or facet of your life that finds it difficult to submit to the lordship of Jesus? Can you trust him and submit to the lordship of Jesus in your finances? Can you trust him and submit to the lordship of Jesus in your family dynamic? Can you trust him and submit to the lordship of Jesus in your career choices, in your brokenness? Can you trust him and submit to the lordship of Jesus in the pain that might be going on in health, finance, with your family? Can you trust and submit to the lordship of Jesus even in your brokenness, the things that you struggle with? That's one thing that all four people, the disciples, the demoniac, Jairus, the woman, they all bowed down and fell at the feet of Jesus. So let's just give it to Jesus. See what that life is like, really, to come back. Our heart's prone to wander, but this is where we come back. Remind ourselves, I trust and submit my life to the lordship of Jesus. All that I have is yours. All that I have, you've given me. Far better I trust it with you than in my hands. So come, heal, work miracles, go beyond our imagination, go beyond our rationalities, and minister to us. Let's just take 30 seconds, invite Jesus right now. Pray out loud and say, Jesus, just minister to me. Jesus, help me worship you. Even in this worship time, let me submit and trust in the lordship of Jesus. I just want to worship you in a free manner.